At 36,000 feet above the Atlantic, a commercial flight full of businessmen, families, and tourists was suddenly gripped by fear. The captain's trembling voice came over the intercom. "If there's any trained fighter pilot on board, please make yourself known." Passengers gasped. Mothers clutched their children. The tension was unbearable. In the middle of it all, a black woman stirred from her nap, unaware that in the next hour she would face not only a test of skill, but also the cruel sting of prejudice. What happened that day shocked the world, and no one on that plane would ever forget the moment she stood up. Before we continue this story, go ahead and subscribe to our channel and like this video, so we can bring you even more amazing stories like this one. Her name was Danielle Brooks, a 34-year-old former US Air Force fighter pilot. After nearly a decade of service, including flying missions overseas, Danielle had retired with honors, though her career had been marred by constant whispers and doubts. Some colleagues admired her skill, but others could never see past her race or gender. She often felt like she had to fly twice as hard and prove herself 10 times over. That afternoon, Danielle was simply another passenger on a transatlantic flight from New York to London. Dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, she blended in, unnoticed by most. The weeks leading up to this trip had been exhausting, and for once, she allowed herself the luxury of closing her eyes, sinking into her seat and drifting into sleep. Around her, the cabin buzzed with ordinary life, children fussing, a businessman typing furiously on his laptop, an elderly couple flipping through a travel guide. It was just another long-haul flight, but high above the ocean, fate was already conspiring to throw the journey into chaos. At first, it was subtle, a jolt of turbulence, a flicker of unease among the crew. Then came the announcement that made hearts skip. The captain's voice cracked with tension as he admitted a critical emergency. A sudden health collapse had rendered the first officer unconscious. A plane of hundreds was now flying with only one pilot, struggling to keep control in worsening weather conditions. And then came the question that silenced the cabin. Is there a trained fighter pilot on board? The cabin erupted in whispers. Eyes darted nervously across the rows of seats. Passengers looked at each other, searching for a hero. The flight attendants, pale-faced and trembling, began moving quickly, scanning the cabin, repeating the captain's desperate plea. Danielle stirred awake, groggy at first, then alert as she absorbed the terrified voices around her. She sat up straighter, her instincts kicking in, heart pounding. She knew she could help. She had to help. But before she could even rise, a murmur began spreading among the passengers. A tall man in a crisp suit, clearly ex-military, judging by the way he carried himself, stood up halfway down the aisle. "I've flown small aircraft before," he said loudly, puffing out his chest. Several passengers clapped in relief, but the lead flight attendant shook her head. "We need a fighter pilot. Only that level of training will do." Danielle unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, steady but calm. "I'm a fighter pilot," she said firmly. Heads turned instantly. Dozens of eyes landed on her, some skeptical, some outright dismissive. A man in the row ahead scoffed audibly. "Huh? You've got to be kidding. This isn't the time for jokes." The whispers grew louder. Some passengers even urged the attendants to pick someone else, convinced she was lying. One woman muttered, "Why would she be a pilot?" Another man added cruelly, "She probably just plays video games." Danielle felt the familiar sting, the weight of prejudice pressing down on her shoulders, just as it had during her military career. The doubt wasn't about her credentials, it was about her skin and her gender. For a brief moment she hesitated. She could stay silent, let them believe she wasn't capable, but the image of hundreds of lives flashing before her eyes hardened her resolve. She pulled her retired Air Force ID card from her wallet and handed it to the flight attendant. The attendant's eyes widened. "Captain, we found one," she whispered into her radio. Even then, disbelief lingered among the passengers. As Danielle walked briskly toward the cockpit, a businessman muttered under his breath, "We're doomed." Inside the cockpit, the scene was chaos. The first officer slumped unconscious in his seat, the captain pale with sweat, fighting to stabilize the plane amid turbulent skies. He glanced at Danielle, hesitation flickering in his eyes. "You're really a fighter pilot?" Danielle slid into the co-pilot's seat without waiting for permission, her hands moving with confident precision. "Yes, sir. And right now, you need me." The storm outside battered the plane, lightning flashing across the darkened sky. Warning alarms blared inside the cockpit as the aircraft dipped violently, sending passengers screaming. Danielle gripped the controls, her training flooding back like muscle memory. The captain barked instructions, but Danielle was already ahead of him, adjusting altitude, correcting yaw, and counteracting the turbulence with a steady hand. The aircraft fought her every move, but she refused to back down. Behind her, the cabin was in chaos. Passengers wept, prayed, and clung to one another as the plane lurched. Some cursed under their breath, convinced they would crash. But Danielle tuned it all out, focusing only on the task at hand. A particularly violent downdraft slammed the plane, alarms shrieking. Danielle's heart pounded, but she remained calm. "I've flown worse," she muttered, remembering war zones where a single mistake meant death. With swift adjustments, she steadied the descent and leveled the aircraft. Minutes dragged into an eternity. At last, the storm began to ease, and the runway lights of an emergency landing strip twinkled in the distance. Danielle guided the plane towards safety, her hands never faltering. The landing was rough but controlled. The wheels screeched against the asphalt, the cabin rattled, and then silence. They were down, alive. For a moment, the passengers sat in stunned quiet. Then, a wave of applause erupted, echoing through the cabin. Some shouted her name, others sobbed with relief. Danielle leaned back in her seat, drenched in sweat, heart still racing, but alive and vindicated. The same people who doubted her had just witnessed her skill firsthand. When the doors finally opened, paramedics rushed aboard to attend to the first officer. The passengers disembarked slowly, many glancing sheepishly at Danielle. The businessman who had scoffed at her earlier avoided her gaze, his arrogance now melted into shame. The woman who had whispered cruel doubts now clasped Danielle's hand, whispering, "Thank you, you saved us all." But Danielle didn't need their validation. She knew what she was capable of, even when others didn't. Still, she couldn't ignore the irony. Only in crisis had they been forced to confront their own prejudices. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Headlines celebrated the mystery woman pilot who saved a plane full of passengers. When her identity was revealed, so was the truth. A decorated black woman fighter pilot who had been doubted until the very last moment. The story sparked heated discussions about bias, gender roles, and how quick society is to underestimate people who don't look the part. Danielle received awards and recognition, but what mattered most to her was the message. Excellence knows no color, no gender. Looking back, she didn't remember the applause or the interviews as much as she remembered the silence. The heavy, doubting silence of the cabin when she first stood up. That moment haunted her, but it also fueled her. Because one question remains for all of us. How many heroes go unrecognized? How many lives are put at risk simply because we fail to see beyond our own prejudice? As Danielle herself later said in an interview, that day wasn't just about saving a plane. It was about proving, again, that who you are doesn't limit what you can do. The only limits are the ones others put on you, and it's time we stop letting them. Suspenseful, error tension optimized. Do you also want me to create 5 image prompts, like cinematic stills, for thumbnails or video visuals to go along with this story?